Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? Liam moved through the world like a ghost, a quiet observer of a life he no longer fully participated in. The clatter and steam of the restaurant kitchen, where he worked as a line cook, was the only symphony he knew now. It was a world of precise movements and shouted orders, a place where he could lose himself in the rhythm of the chop, the sizzle, the plate. But once his shift ended and he stepped out into the cold night air, the silence that enveloped him was a heavy cloak. It was a silence carved out by tragedy 5 years prior, a silence that echoed with the ghosts of a wife's laughter and a daughter's bright, sunny questions. His tiny apartment was not a home, it was a waiting room, a space kept meticulously clean as if expecting guests who would never arrive. Tonight, the city was a blur of hurried footsteps and averted gazes. The November wind had a cruel bite, and people rushed along, their collars turned up against the cold and their minds turned inward, focused on the warm destinations that awaited them. Liam clutched the thin fabric of his jacket, a container of leftover soup from the restaurant tucked under his arm, a meager but warm prize. It was on a side street, a shortcut he often took, that he saw them. They were huddled in the recessed doorway of a closed shop, a small, desperate island in the river of indifferent pedestrians. A man, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat, sat on the cold concrete. His face, etched with worry, was turned down, as if he couldn't bear to meet the eyes of the world that had cast him out. Beside him, 2 little girls, identical down to the worried frowns on their small faces, shivered in threadbare coats. They looked to be about 7 years old. One held a small, unsteady piece of cardboard. In a child's shaky handwriting, it read, "Anything helps. God bless." Liam's heart seized. It was the sight of the children, their innocent faces pinched with cold and confusion, that broke through the numb wall he had built around himself. He saw the ghost of his own daughter in their wide, dark eyes. He stopped. Most people hurried past, their pace quickening as if poverty were a contagion they could catch. But one man, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, paused. He looked down at the small family with a sneer curling his lip. "Get a job, you bum," the man spat, his voice loud and laced with contempt. He then kicked a stray soda can, sending it clattering against the wall, inches from one of the little girls, who flinched violently. The man, the father, didn't even look up, as if he had absorbed so many blows that one more was just static. The man in the suit laughed, a short, ugly sound, before striding off into the night, disappearing into the uncaring crowd. The act of casual cruelty was a stone dropped into the still, deep well of Liam's grief. An anger, hot and unfamiliar, flared in his chest. It was an anger on behalf of this broken family, a righteous indignation against a world that could allow such a thing, that could walk past such visible pain. He looked down at the warm container in his hand and felt the worn $20 bill in his pocket. It was the last of his money until payday, earmarked for his own sparse groceries for the week. But in that moment, his own hunger, his own needs, vanished. They were nothing compared to the yawning chasm of despair he saw in that doorway. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was a compulsion, a command from a part of himself he thought had died long ago. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and he walked towards them, his footsteps suddenly heavy with purpose. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man with a choice to make, a choice to step out of the shadows and into someone else's darkness, holding a tiny, flickering light. Liam approached the small, huddled group slowly, not wanting to startle them. The father, David, finally looked up as Liam's worn work boots came into his line of sight. His eyes were hollow, filled with a profound shame that was painful to witness. Before David could speak, to protest, or to shrink away, Liam knelt down, bringing himself to the children's eye level. He held out the container of soup. "I just finished my shift," he said, his voice soft, gentle. "They gave me extra. It's still hot. Please, take it." The aroma of the rich tomato soup, a simple thing, filled the cold air and seemed for a moment to be the most luxurious scent in the world. David's mouth opened, but no words came out. His pride was a fragile shield, already shattered into 1,000 pieces. He shook his head weakly. We couldn't possibly, he stammered. But his protest was drowned out by the quiet awe on his daughters' faces. Their eyes were fixed on the soup, then on Liam's kind face. One of the twins, her voice a tiny whisper, asked, "Are you an angel?" The question, so pure and so innocent, hung in the air, disarming the tension. A sad smile touched Liam's lips. "No, sweetie. Just a cook." He then reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled $20 bill. He pressed it into David's hand, closing the man's cold fingers around it. "Please. For them." David looked at the money, then at Liam, and his composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. I don't know what to say," he choked out. Liam didn't press. He simply stayed there, kneeling on the cold pavement, a silent offering of solidarity. He asked gently, "What happened?" The story spilled out of David in a torrent of quiet desperation. His name was David, a musician, a pianist. He'd lost his part-time teaching job a month ago. He had tried to find any work, anything, but nothing had come through. The landlord, a man with a heart of stone, had been unforgiving. They had been evicted that very morning. He had no family to turn to, no friends left who weren't themselves struggling. He had spent the day trying to sell his last valuable possession, a vintage keyboard, but the pawn shops offered him next to nothing. As dusk fell, with his daughters hungry and cold, he had swallowed the last of his pride and found this doorway. He had failed them. He was a failure. Each word was a self-inflicted wound. Liam listened to it all, his own heart aching with a familiar sorrow. He understood the anatomy of loss, the weight of feeling like you've let down the people you love most. He saw the alley, felt the biting wind, and looked at the faces of the two little girls, Maya and Mia, who were now huddled together, sharing the warmth of the soup, taking turns with the single plastic spoon Liam had provided. He couldn't leave them there. He couldn't walk away and return to his empty apartment, knowing they were out here, alone in the dark. The thought was unbearable. In that instant, another decision was made, one far bigger than a container of soup and $20. It was a leap of faith, a step into the unknown. "Come home with me," Liam said, the words feeling both strange and perfectly right on his tongue. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" "My apartment, it's not much," Liam continued, his voice steady and sincere. "It's just a small room, really. But it's warm. And it's safe. You can have my bed. I'll take the couch. Just for tonight. Please. Let me help." It was an insane offer. To invite a complete stranger and his two children into his home. The city was full of warnings against such things. But Liam wasn't listening to the city. He was listening to the quiet, insistent voice of his own humanity, a voice that told him this was the only thing to do. This was the moment where his life, a straight, predictable line, could bend into a new and unknown shape. The walk to Liam's apartment was a silent procession through the sleeping city. David walked with his head down, clutching the hands of his daughters, who in turn looked up at Liam with a mixture of apprehension and wonder. The building was old, the paint in the hallway peeling, but as Liam unlocked his door and switched on the light, the space they entered was an oasis of order and warmth. It was, as he had said, small. A single room served as a living area and kitchenette, with a small, curtained-off alcove for a bed. But it was immaculate. A few well-tended plants sat on the windowsill, and a single, faded photograph stood on a small mantelpiece, a smiling woman and a little girl with a gap-toothed grin. This was the silent, sacred heart of Liam's solitude. Without fuss, Liam went about making his unexpected guests comfortable. He pulled clean sheets and a thick blanket from a closet and gestured toward the alcove. "The bed is yours," he said to David. "The girls need a proper place to sleep." He then turned to Maya and Mia, his expression softening. "Are you two still hungry?" I think I have some milk and cookies. The girls' eyes lit up, and they nodded shyly. Soon, they were sitting at the tiny kitchen table, sipping warm milk and munching on store-bought cookies, their earlier fear melting away in the gentle atmosphere of Liam's home. David watched the scene, a lump forming in his throat. He felt like a man drowning who had just been thrown a lifeline, and the relief was so overwhelming it was physically painful. Once the girls were tucked into the warm bed, their breathing finally evening out into the soft rhythm of sleep, the two men sat in the dimly lit living area. Liam sat on his worn armchair, David on the small, lumpy couch that would be his bed. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but filled with a heavy, shared understanding. To fill it, David began to talk, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. He spoke of his dreams, of being a classical pianist, of the scholarship to Juilliard he'd given up when he found out his girlfriend was pregnant. He spoke of his love for music, how it was the only language he felt he could truly speak. He talked about his wife, who had loved the idea of being married to an artist but couldn't handle the reality of the financial instability. She had left him a year ago, leaving him to raise the twins on his own. He confessed his deepest fear, that he was a curse, that his passion for music had only brought ruin upon his family, and that his daughters would be better off without him. He was unburdening a soul that had carried its weight alone for far too long. Liam listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer cheap solutions or hollow reassurances. He just listened, his gaze steady and compassionate. He knew the landscape of despair intimately. When David finally fell silent, exhausted from his own confession, Liam spoke, his voice quiet but resonant. "I had a daughter," he said, his eyes drifting to the photograph on the mantel. "Her name was Lily. And a wife, Sarah." He told David about the accident. A rainy night, a drunk driver. How he had been at work, in a different kitchen, a much fancier one that he owned. He had been a chef with his own celebrated restaurant, a rising star. And in a single moment, a single phone call, it was all gone. The restaurant, the passion, the future. He had sold everything, unable to bear the memories, and had drifted until he landed here, in this simple job, in this quiet room. He was hiding from a life that had become too painful to live. In the shared space of their grief, a fragile bridge was built. Two broken men, two fathers, from entirely different worlds, found a common ground in their pain. David looked at Liam, truly seeing him for the first time, not just as a kind stranger, but as a fellow traveler in sorrow. The walls he had built around his heart, walls of shame and failure, began to show the first tiny cracks. In the quiet solitude of another man's grief, he felt the first, faint and terrifying flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. The thought was a revelation. The first rays of dawn crept through the window, painting the small apartment in soft, gray light. The first thing Liam noticed was the sound. Not the usual oppressive silence, but a soft, rustling sound, followed by a whispered giggle. He opened his eyes and saw the twin girls, Maya and Mia, sitting on the floor at the foot of his armchair, where he had fallen asleep. They were drawing on the back of some old receipts from his pocket with a pen they must have found on the table. They were drawing a picture of a man with a chef's hat giving a flower to two little girls. A wave of emotion, so potent it almost buckled him, washed over Liam. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 5 years, the simple, profound warmth of a home filled with the presence of children. David emerged from the alcove, his hair disheveled, his face still etched with the exhaustion of his ordeal, but the haunted look in his eyes had softened. He saw his daughters, safe and content, and then his gaze met Liam's. A silent understanding passed between them, a gratitude too deep for words. "I made coffee," Liam said, his voice a little rough. "And I think I can scrape together enough for some toast." The morning unfolded with a sense of surreal domesticity. The four of them sat around the tiny table, the girls happily munching on their toast, chattering about their drawing. Liam found himself smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He listened to them talk, asking them about their favorite colors and what they wanted to be when they grew up. Maya wanted to be a doctor, and Mia wanted to be an artist. David watched the interaction, his heart aching with a bittersweet mix of joy and sadness. He saw how naturally Liam fell into the role of a caregiver, how his gruff exterior melted away to reveal a wellspring of gentleness. He saw a paternal warmth in Liam that reminded him of what a family was supposed to feel like. It was in the middle of this quiet, hopeful moment that the mail carrier's footsteps sounded in the hall, followed by the soft thud of letters falling through the mail slot in the door. Liam went to get them, shuffling through the usual assortment of bills and junk mail. But one envelope stood out. It was thick, made of expensive paper, and bore the insignia of a prestigious law firm. It was addressed to Mr. David Sterling. The name was a shock. David's last name wasn't Sterling. Or so Liam thought. He handed the letter to David, whose face paled as he saw the return address. "It must have been forwarded from my old apartment," he mumbled, his hands trembling slightly as he took it. "Probably just the final notice from the landlord, telling me how much more I owe him." A fresh wave of despair washed over his face. He seemed to shrink in on himself again, the hope of the morning threatening to evaporate. He hesitated, the letter feeling like a bomb in his hands. He couldn't face another blow, not now. Liam saw the fear in his eyes. He put a steadying hand on David's shoulder. The gesture was firm, grounding. "Whatever it is," Liam said, his voice low and certain, "you're not facing it alone now. Open it." Bolstered by Liam's quiet strength, David took a deep breath. He slid his finger under the seal and broke it. He unfolded the heavy document inside, his eyes scanning the first few lines. The color drained from his face completely. He swayed slightly, and Liam instinctively tightened his grip on his shoulder to steady him. David's mouth fell open. He read the lines again, and then a third time, as if his brain refused to process the words printed there in stark, black ink. He looked up at Liam, his eyes wide with a wild, unreadable expression, a terrifying cocktail of shock, confusion, and something else, something Liam couldn't begin to name. He was utterly, completely, and irrevocably stunned. The letter was not from his landlord. It was from the executors of an estate. The estate of his father, Jonathan Sterling. David stared at the name, a name he hadn't spoken in years, a name that tasted like ash and rejection in his mouth. Jonathan Sterling, the cold, ruthless titan of industry who had disowned him a decade ago when David had chosen the ivory keys of a piano over the cold steel of the family's construction empire. He called music a child's hobby, David whispered, the words barely audible, his eyes still glued to the page. The letter went on, its legalistic language weaving a story that felt like a fantasy. Jonathan Sterling had passed away 2 weeks ago from a sudden heart attack. And in his final days, riddled with a regret he had never voiced aloud, he had made a new will. A single, dramatic act of repentance. He had cut out the distant cousins and business partners. He had left everything, his entire fortune, his vast portfolio of real estate, his controlling stake in Sterling Industries, to his only son, David. The man who was, just 24 hours ago, sitting in an alley with his children, begging for spare change, was now the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar fortune. The word swam before David's eyes. Billion. The word had no meaning. He looked at the legal document in his trembling hands, then at his daughters, who were now engaged in a serious debate over whether a unicorn could beat a dragon in a fight. He looked at the half-eaten piece of toast on his plate. He looked at Liam, the quiet, grieving cook who had given him his last $20, who had opened his home and his heart without a moment's hesitation. The cosmic irony of it all was a physical blow. Yesterday, he was invisible, a piece of human refuse to be sneered at and kicked aside. Today, he was one of the wealthiest men in the country. The whiplash was so violent it made him feel nauseous. He wasn't filled with joy. He wasn't filled with triumph. He was filled with a profound, earth-shattering sense of dislocation. He began to shake, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in his hands and spread through his entire body. He sank onto the couch, the letter falling from his grasp. And then he broke. Sobs tore through him, not quiet tears of gratitude, but ragged, wrenching sounds of a soul breaking apart and trying to reassemble itself in a new, unrecognizable shape. He wept for his father, the man he had hated and yearned for in equal measure. He wept for the years of struggle, the poverty, the shame. He wept for the sheer, brutal absurdity of it all. And most of all, he wept with a gratitude so immense it was agonizing, a gratitude for the one man who had seen him not as a beggar, but as a human being. Liam was stunned into silence. He picked up the letter and read it, his own mind struggling to catch up. A billionaire. This man, whose pride was so wounded he could barely accept a bowl of soup, was a billionaire. Liam's first thought wasn't of the money. His first thought was for the man unraveling before him. He knelt down in front of David, just as he had in the alleyway. He didn't say, "Congratulations." He didn't say, "Your problems are over." He simply put a hand on David's knee, a solid point of contact in a world that had just spun off its axis. "Breathe," Liam said softly. "Just breathe." The girls, sensing the shift in the room's emotional climate, fell silent. They came over and flanked their father, each one placing a small hand on his arm, their faces filled with a solemn, childlike concern. In that moment, they were not the heirs to a fortune. They were just a family, huddled together in a tiny apartment, anchored by the quiet, steady presence of a stranger who had become, in the span of a single night, the most important person in their world. The truth had arrived, and it was more stunning and more complicated than any of them could have ever imagined. The first few hours after the revelation were a blur. David, guided by Liam's steadying presence, made the call to the law firm. The voice on the other end was deferential, respectful, a tone David hadn't heard directed at him in a decade. The lawyer confirmed everything. A new life was waiting, a life of boardrooms and unimaginable wealth. It felt like a suit of clothes that was 1,000 sizes too big. After the call, David sat in silence for a long time, watching his daughters play. They were oblivious, their world still measured in cookies and crayons. He watched Liam quietly washing the breakfast dishes, his movements methodical and calm, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And David knew, with a certainty that cut through the fog of his shock, what his first act must be. It wasn't to buy a mansion or a sports car. It was to secure the future of the man who had secured his. He turned to Liam, his voice still hoarse with emotion. "Liam," he started, the name feeling inadequate for the depth of his gratitude. "How can I ever repay you? You gave my girls, everything." "Not the money," he clarified, seeing a flicker of protest in Liam's eyes. "You gave us hope. You saw us when we were less than ghosts. No one else did." Liam finished drying a plate and placed it carefully on the rack. He turned, leaning against the small counter. "You don't owe me anything, David," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Kindness shouldn't come with a price tag. I did what I hope anyone would have done." But David shook his head fiercely. "But they didn't, Liam. Don't you see? No one else did. One man sneered at us, and 100 others just walked by. You stopped. That's everything." He looked around the small, sparse apartment. He saw the worn-out chef's whites hanging on a hook by the door. He saw the faded photograph on the mantel, a constant, silent testament to Liam's own profound loss. This man was a hero, living a life of quiet desperation. He wasn't just a kind man, he was a wounded soul, just like David. And David, now possessed of impossible means, knew he could help heal him. "I'm not offering to pay you back," David said, his voice gaining a new strength, a new purpose. "I'm offering you a partnership. A friendship. Don't go back to that kitchen, cooking for people who don't know your name. Come with me. Help me navigate this madness. I don't know how to be a billionaire. I don't know the first thing about running a company. But I know people. And I know you are the best person I have ever met. Be my advisor. Be my conscience. The offer hung in the air between them. But David wasn't finished. He remembered the story Liam had told him, about the restaurant he had once owned, the dream that had been shattered. "You told me you were a chef," David said, his eyes lighting up with an idea. "A real chef. Not just a line cook. You had your own place." Liam's face tightened, the old pain surfacing. "That was a different life." "It doesn't have to be," David pressed, his voice filled with passion. "We can build it again. Better. Anything you want. Your own restaurant, no compromises. A place built on the same principles you live by. Kindness. Second chances." He then looked over at his daughters. "More importantly," David's voice softened, "be part of our family. Maya and Mia, they already love you. Stay with us, Liam. Help me raise them. Please." It was more than a job offer. It was an invitation to a new life. A chance to step out of the shadows for good. For Liam, it was a terrifying proposition. It meant leaving the safe, numb cocoon he had built for himself. It meant feeling again, dreaming again, and opening himself up to the possibility of losing it all once more. But as he looked at the hopeful face of this man and the bright, innocent eyes of his two little girls, he knew he couldn't say no. He was already a part of their story. His life was already bending in this new, unforeseen direction. He gave a single, slow nod. And in that small, quiet room, a new family was born. With the foundation of their new life set, David's mind turned to the past, specifically to the moment of casual cruelty that had been the catalyst for everything. The sneering man in the expensive suit. The landlord who had thrown his family onto the street. He remembered the name on the eviction notice, Mr. Sterling. The same last name as his own. He felt a chill. He described the man to Liam, the sharp suit, the arrogant demeanor, the cruel words. A quick search on David's new, company-issued laptop confirmed their suspicion. The man was Marcus Sterling, David's cousin, the very man who had stood to inherit a significant portion of the Sterling empire before the last-minute change to the will. And the cruel landlord who had evicted him? It was one of Marcus's subsidiary companies. The injustice was not just random, it was personal, familial. A fresh wave of anger, cold and clear, washed over David. But it was tempered by Liam's quiet wisdom. This wasn't about simple revenge. It was about justice. It was about turning a moment of darkness into a source of light. Armed with the formidable resources of Sterling Industries and a team of the best lawyers money could buy, David began to dig. He discovered that Marcus's real estate empire was a house of cards, built on predatory loans, unethical practices, and a complete disregard for the human cost of his business. He was a slumlord in a bespoke suit, preying on the most vulnerable while projecting an image of success and philanthropy. David, with Liam as his silent, steady counsel, formulated a plan. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential. He used his new position as head of Sterling Industries to quietly acquire the debt that Marcus's companies owed to various financial institutions. Within a week, David Sterling, the man his cousin had derided as a bum, was Marcus's single largest creditor. He controlled his fate. The meeting was set at the main Sterling Industries headquarters, in the top-floor boardroom that overlooked the entire city. Marcus Sterling arrived, arrogant and preening, believing he was meeting with a new, mysterious investor interested in expanding his portfolio. He strode into the room, his hand outstretched, a predatory smile on his face. And then he stopped dead. Sitting at the head of the massive oak table, flanked by lawyers, was his cousin David, the failed musician, the man he had seen begging in an alley just a week ago. And standing quietly behind him, a sentinel of calm, was the shabby-looking cook who had been with him. Marcus's face, a mask of smug confidence, crumpled into a canvas of disbelief and horror. "You," he sputtered, his voice a strangled gasp. "How?" David didn't smile. His face was calm, his eyes holding a steely resolve that Marcus had never seen before. Hello, cousin, David said, his voice even. Please, have a seat. We have a lot to discuss. It seems you and I have a number of business interests in common. He gestured to a thick file in front of him. I've been reviewing the portfolio of your company, Sterling Properties. It's quite the operation. I was particularly interested in your eviction practices. Tell me, Marcus, do you make it a habit to kick children out onto the street? Marcus's face cycled through shades of red and white. He was trapped, cornered, and he knew it. He looked from David's unyielding face to the impassive expressions of the lawyers. He was a shark who had suddenly found himself in a tank with a whale. The power dynamic had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The poetic justice of the moment was thick in the air, a silent, powerful testament to the fact that the universe, in its own mysterious way, often balances its own books. The bully was about to face his reckoning. Marcus Sterling, the man who had built his world on the intimidation of others, was now reduced to a stammering, sputtering mess. He tried to bluster, to threaten, but his words were empty. David let him exhaust himself before he laid out the terms. It was not a negotiation, it was a verdict. I now own your debt, Marcus, David stated, his voice devoid of malice but full of an unshakable authority. Every predatory loan, every overleveraged asset. I could bankrupt you with a single phone call. I could dismantle the hollow empire you've built and leave you with less than what you thought I had when you saw me in that alley. Marcus paled, the reality of his ruin crashing down on him. But David leaned forward, his expression changing from stern to something more complex. But that's not what's going to happen, he continued. That would be your way of doing things. It's not mine. He pushed a different set of documents across the table. I am establishing a new charitable foundation. The Sterling Second Chance Foundation. Its mission will be to provide safe, stable, and truly affordable housing for families on the brink, for single parents, for anyone who has been cast aside and needs a hand up, not a handout. He paused, letting the words sink in. You have two choices, Marcus. You can face a litany of lawsuits for your business practices and the public disgrace that will follow, leading to your complete financial and social ruin. Or, you can sell me your entire real estate portfolio, every last building, for a fraction of its market value. We will gut the predatory business model and repurpose these properties for the foundation. You walk away with just enough to start over, humbled, but not destroyed. The choice is yours. Humiliation and rage warred on Marcus's face, but fear won. He knew he was beaten. Defeated and stripped of his power, he signed the papers, his hand shaking. His empire of greed, built on the suffering of others, was dismantled in a single hour, its bricks and mortar now destined to become sanctuaries for those he had once exploited. The antagonist was vanquished, not by brute force, but by a more powerful, more creative act of justice. With that chapter closed, David turned his full attention to the future, and specifically to Liam. His promise was not an empty one. He located the very building where Liam had once run his celebrated restaurant, Lily's Table. It had since changed hands and was now a failing, generic bistro. David bought the entire building. He presented the keys and the deed to Liam one afternoon, standing on the sidewalk in front of the familiar facade. Liam stared at the keys in his hand, his heart pounding. It was the ghost of his former life, a place he had avoided for 5 long years. It's yours, Liam, David said softly. The whole building. Renovate it. Rebuild it. Dream it all over again. No more cooking to someone else's schedule, for bosses who don't see the artist you are. Create your own art again. We'll call it the second chance, if you like. Tears welled in Liam's eyes, the first he had shed for himself in years. It wasn't about the money or the property. It was about being seen. David saw not just the kind man who had helped him, but the grieving husband, the broken father, and the brilliant chef whose passion had been buried under layers of pain. He was being given back not just a restaurant, but a piece of his own soul. The dream he thought had died on that rainy night 5 years ago was being resurrected. He could feel the frost that had encased his heart for so long finally beginning to thaw. He could cook again, not for survival, but for joy. He could create again, not as a distraction, but as a tribute. He looked at David, his brother, and for the first time in a very long time, he saw a future that was not a bleak expanse of gray, but a canvas waiting for new color. The months that followed were a whirlwind of purposeful activity and quiet healing. The city saw the headlines: the mysterious new head of Sterling Industries, the sudden philanthropic shift, the establishment of the Second Chance Foundation. But the real story was happening away from the public eye, in the spaces between two men and two little girls forging a new kind of family. David, with Liam's unwavering moral compass to guide him, threw himself into transforming his father's company. He was a natural leader, possessed of an empathy and integrity the corporation had never known. He implemented fair wage policies, started community outreach programs, and began steering the massive construction firm towards building not just luxury towers, but sustainable, compassionate communities. He was honoring his father's legacy not by emulating his ruthlessness, but by redeeming it. Meanwhile, Liam poured his heart and soul into the resurrection of his restaurant. The space was gutted and rebuilt, not as a replica of the past, but as something new, something hopeful. He designed the kitchen himself, a gleaming state-of-the-art space that felt like a sanctuary. He named it, simply, the Hearth. It was a place of warmth, of gathering, of nourishment for both body and soul. The restaurant's philosophy was as important as its menu. Liam made it a point to hire people who, like him, needed a second chance. He hired former inmates, recovering addicts, single mothers struggling to get back on their feet. He trained them, mentored them, and paid them a living wage. His kitchen was a place of redemption, a testament to the belief that no one was beyond saving. And the food was magic. Liam cooked with a passion he thought he had lost forever. Every dish was an expression of his journey, of loss, of gratitude, of newfound hope. The Hearth became the most talked about restaurant in the city, not just for its incredible food, but for the story that infused its very walls. But the true heart of their new life was the home they now shared. David had purchased a large but unassuming house with a sprawling backyard. It was a world away from Liam's tiny apartment, but they brought the same sense of warmth and connection to it. The sound of Maya and Mia's laughter echoed through the halls, a constant, joyful melody. They were enrolled in a wonderful school, taking art classes and music lessons, their lives blossoming in the sunshine of safety and love. Their favorite place, however, was the kitchen at the Hearth. Dressed in tiny, custom-made chef's jackets, they would stand on stools beside Uncle Liam, their official taste testers and cookie dough makers. Liam, in turn, found a joy in their presence that filled the hollow spaces in his heart. They were not a replacement for the daughter he had lost, but they were a continuation of love, a new generation to nurture and cherish. The bond between Liam and David solidified into a quiet, unshakable brotherhood. They were an unlikely pair, the billionaire CEO and the humble chef, but they were two halves of a whole. David provided the means, the grand vision, while Liam provided the grounding, the moral clarity. They were a family, forged in the crucible of a cold night in an alleyway, bound not by blood, but by a shared understanding of what it meant to be broken and what it took to become whole again. The house was no longer just a structure, it was a home, filled with love, laughter, and the comforting aroma of something wonderful always cooking on the stove. 1 year. 365 days since that cold November night. The city was once again bracing for winter, but inside the Hearth, the air was warm and filled with the celebratory buzz of a full house. The restaurant was a roaring success, a beacon of hope and culinary excellence. Every table was filled with people laughing, talking, and savoring the food that Liam created with so much love. Tonight, however, the most important reservation was for a corner table, tucked away from the main bustle of the dining room. At that table sat David, Maya, Mia, and Liam. It was the anniversary of the night their lives had collided and changed forever. Maya and Mia, now a year older and radiating a happy confidence, were showing off a new drawing to Liam, this one a detailed portrait of the four of them, labeled Our Family. David watched them, a gentle smile on his face. He looked different now. The haunted, defeated look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm strength and a deep, abiding sense of peace. He had grown into his role, not as a titan of industry, but as a compassionate leader and, most importantly, a devoted father. He caught Liam's eye across the table. Liam, too, was transformed. The grief was still a part of him, a quiet undercurrent, but it no longer defined him. His face was fuller, his smiles came easily, and his eyes, which had once been clouded with sorrow, now shone with purpose and affection. He was a man who had found his way back to the light. David raised his glass of sparkling cider, a gesture that included the whole table. His voice was thick with an emotion that was always just beneath the surface when he looked at these three people. A year ago, he began, his voice soft but clear, I was sitting on a piece of cold concrete, believing my life was over. I believed I had failed my children. I believed we were invisible to the world. He looked directly at Liam, his gaze intense and full of a love that transcended friendship. And then an angel in a cook's uniform knelt down and offered us a bowl of soup. He gave us his last $20. He gave us a place to sleep. But he gave us so much more than that. He turned his gaze to his daughters, who were listening with rapt attention. He gave us back our faith in humanity. He taught me that true wealth isn't what you have in a bank account, but what you have in your heart. It's not about the money you accumulate, but about the kindness you are willing to give away, especially when you have nothing else to offer. He raised his glass higher. So, I'd like to make a toast, he said, his voice cracking slightly. To Liam. To the man who gave us his last $20 and, in doing so, gave us the world. To the brother I chose and the uncle my girls adore. To our family. Liam raised his own glass, his eyes shining with unshed tears. To us, he said simply. To second chances. The four of them clinked their glasses together, a small, clear sound that sealed their promise to each other. They were a mosaic of broken pieces, glued back together by kindness and compassion, stronger and more beautiful than before. They were a testament to the extraordinary power of a single, simple choice. They were whole. They were home. In the end, this was the stunning truth that had been revealed that next day, not that a poor man had become a billionaire, but that four lonely souls, lost in their own private darkness, had found each other and created a family, a true fortune that no amount of money could ever buy. What did you think of Liam's incredible act of compassion? And what about the stunning turn of events for David? Sometimes, help arrives when we least expect it, from the most unexpected of people. This story reminds us that we should never, ever judge a book by its cover. The person you ignore on the street today could be the very person who holds the key to changing your life tomorrow. Every single person has a story, a struggle, a heart full of hopes and fears. Liam's choice to see the human being behind the circumstance didn't just save David, it saved himself. It opened a door out of his own prison of grief and back into a life of meaning and love. David, in turn, used his new power not for revenge, but for redemption, turning a system of greed into a fountain of hope for countless others. This is the ripple effect of kindness. It never ends with the first act. It flows outwards, touching lives in ways we may never even see. It is the most powerful currency we possess. Let this story be a reminder to all of us. Look up from your phones, look around you. See the people in your community. A small gesture, a smile, a kind word, a shared meal, can be the lifeline someone is desperately praying for. You have the power to be someone's Liam. You have the power to be the light in someone's darkness. What is one small act of kindness you can commit to this week? Let us know your thoughts and your pledge in the comments below. Your story might just inspire someone else. And if this story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to Soul Lift Stories and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video that will warm your heart and lift your soul. Share this video with your friends, your family, or anyone who needs a powerful reminder that there is still so much good in the world, and that the greatest treasures in life are the connections we forge with one another. Thank you for watching, and remember, be the reason someone believes in the goodness of people.